Alright guys, Murphs here, and today we're going to do a little comparison video, comparing bullpups to standard rifle layouts. Now this is actually a question that I get from a lot of friends and coworkers and stuff like that, because they see bullpups in video games and movies and stuff like that. And they're curious as to any advantages that the system actually provides, and that's something that I kind of want to take an opportunity to dive into in this video with a little bit of shooting footage interspersed throughout. Now, first off, we do have to go ahead and define some terms in case there are some latecomers to this conversation to begin with. Now, a bullpup is a weapon system that has the receiver of the rifle located to the rear of the pistol grip. So, if we take this LWRC M6 IC-A5, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description, we can see that we have a standard rifle layout, right? We have our pistol grip right here, and then we have the receiver to the kind of in front of and above position, and then our barrel running out this direction, stock, and the location that we would expect to have stock. And this is more or less a standard, right? SKS, AK-47, anything else that you look at has this type of layout. Now that's as opposed to a bullpup, like this IWI X95 Tavor, previously reviewed on the channel. Link in the description. Now, as we can see here, we have our pistol grip right here, but based off of our ejection port, our receiver is actually located to the rear and our barrel runs from here to here. Now, the interesting thing being is that both of these are 16-inch barrels. However, if we stack them butt to butt, we can see that the LWRC with the 16-inch barrel is substantially longer. So that's kind of the genesis of the entire discussion here. The whole point of bullpups is to have a nice compact design with comparable barrel length to any of your standard rifles, or shorter if you want to, and still have an even shorter design. Now, let's go ahead and hop into a little bit of history. And at any time, guys, you're kind of getting bored in the section, go ahead and check the description, and I'll have annotated where different parts of the video take up at, so you can go ahead and jump ahead and get the actual content that you want. Maybe come back and check on stuff if you're curious about something later. Now, history-wise, coming out of World War II, a lot of militaries were looking to refine their arsenals. They had a lot of different weapon systems, a lot of different calibers that they were trying to provide for, and simplicity is an important aspect in warfare. If you have nice, streamlined supply lines, weapon systems, your training transparency goes up, the ability to be able to actually supply troops in the field goes up, and you're less likely to lose the war overall. So everyone was trying to look at a way to be able to adapt submachine guns and rifles together, bring the whole concept together. And a couple of different people would take it in a couple of different directions. The Soviets would develop the AK-47 to be at first a replacement of the PPSH-41, PPS-43, all those submachine guns, as well as develop the SKS in order to replace the Mosin-Nagant rifles. Something semi-automatic with an intermediate cartridge. Now, the AK and the SKS both utilize the 7.62x39, and ultimately, since the AK does have a semi-automatic setting, it would replace the SKS because you could push it out to the same distances as that cartridge is capable of going to. The sights were just as capable of doing so, as well as being able to flip it over to full automatic in order to be able to put up a strong barrage of fire to be able to overrun your enemies, which is the whole point of a submachine gun to begin with. Short range, high volume fire so that you could use it, say, inside a building, or be able to put effective fire on a trench to be able to maneuver against the enemy who couldn't risk firing back for fear of getting shot. Now, that's the direction the Soviets would go. The US would decide that they could take a rifle and a full power rifle cartridge, drop it into an M1 Garand lookalike with a detachable box magazine known as the M14, and then just add full auto fire, and then it would be able to be everything. It could be a marksman's rifle, it could be the average rifleman's rifle, it could be a light automatic rifle, as well as a submachine gun. Now, history tells us that didn't work out very well, and eventually they would kind of go along the Soviet line with the M16 and the 5.56 cartridge, but that would take a little bit. That would take some trial and error and a couple of painful mistakes along the way. Now, the British initially would actually look at going yet another evolutionary direction by developing the EM2 rifle. That, combined with a proprietary intermediate cartridge, was what they wanted to make to be the new standard NATO offering. Now, they would actually adopt that rifle for about 48 hours before the rest of NATO would convince them to go with the FN FAL, and the United States would convince NATO to go with the 308 cartridge. Now, in British designation, the FN FAL would be the L1A1 SLR, but that doesn't really have a whole lot of bearing on our current conversation. Now, bullpup rifles would not fizzle out with the EM2. We would actually see the development return in the 1970s, first with the French FAMAS rifle in 1975, as well as the Austrian adoption of the Sturmgewehr 77 in 1978, also known as the Steyr AUG. Now, this rifle would also be adopted by Australia and New Zealand eventually. The British would adopt the L85 in the 80s, and you would also see the Chinese developed the, I believe, Q95. I'll annotate below if I'm wrong on that designation. Bullpup rifle in their own proprietary intermediate cartridge. Now, in the 2000s, the Israelis would develop the Tavor series of rifles, of which this is a U.S. legal MTAR, or micro Tavor assault rifle. And actually, FN would come up with the F2000, which unfortunately has not done very well in either military or civilian sales and seems to have petered out almost entirely. The only one I've ever seen was in the hands of a Saudi Arabian soldier just a couple of years ago, which Saudi Arabia was an adopter of the F2000. So that pretty much brings us up to the current date. Let's go ahead and start talking about advantages and disadvantages between these systems. And we'll talk about some of the civilian type rifles that are out there on the market as we go through a lot of the pros and cons here. Now, we have a super compact system, which is fantastic, but it's not without its own issues. First off, real estate. We don't have a lot of real estate on most of these rifles. The X95 is actually probably about the best setup when it comes to forward Picatinny rails. But if you look at like the Steyr AUG, there's not a lot to grip onto. Now, earlier in warfare, just a couple of years ago, when lights and lasers and all that kind of stuff was not all that common, it wasn't that big of a deal. But now, with the wide proliferation of MVGs and night vision fighting capability in warfare in general, all throughout all developed nations, you kind of need a place to be able to mount your lasers in order to be able to effectively utilize your MVGs. So that is definitely something that some of these older bullpup systems are getting upgraded and updated for. The AUG has quite a few aftermarket accessories you can buy in order to be able to make it more adaptable to different types of setups. Other countries, I'm not so sure what it is that they're doing to work around that, aside from adopting new, more modern rifles. Now, this also makes it difficult to get that thumb over bore grip that is so frequently taught, mostly because you're in this exceedingly scrunched up position, which, if you're pieing corners and all that kind of stuff, may not necessarily be the biggest issue, but there is something to be said for being able to kind of spread yourself out on a rifle. So with this LWRC, I can really drive my barrel towards whatever it is that I'm trying to shoot at, right? So especially if I have multiple targets right out in front of me, I can more easily control the pace at which I move between those targets. Whereas when I try to do the same thing with this rifle, this kind of scrunched up position, I have the possibility to over travel and have to correct back onto the target. It's not necessarily guaranteed, it's definitely something that you can train, but it's something you kind of have to work around. Now, in addition to that, with a lot of bullpups, you run into an interesting dynamic in this kind of scrunched up position with your iron sights, to where you don't necessarily have the best, since you don't have as much real estate out in front of you, you don't necessarily have the best sight radius. Now, in handguns, a lot of people like to make a big deal out of sight radius, as though the difference between a 4-inch handgun and a 5-inch handgun is going to make all the difference in your group sizes with handguns. I don't shoot handguns for groups really to begin with. It's not terribly interesting to me. As you know, as long as I'm making body hits, I'm pretty happy. Tight body hits, of course, but I'm not necessarily measuring them and concerned about half an inch difference between the two. I really don't stress out about sight radius on handguns, but rifles I do, because I'm actually reaching out to distance, significant distances potentially with those iron sights. And when we're talking about that with things like iron sights on a rifle, those little differences in sight radius are going to really make themselves known once you start trying to reach out to like 300. So Something to just kind of think about there if you're planning on having to at any time run iron sights on a rifle. Now, of course, length. We've already talked about it, but this being so readily compact right off the bat with the same length of barrel is pretty neat. You see the same type of thing with both the FAMAS as well as the Steyr AUG, where those are near 20-inch barrels, and when you put those up against an M16A1, that's a pretty significant difference there in overall length. Those rifles are definitely beating out the M16A1, yet they are able to maintain the same velocity, which means, especially when we're talking about a 5.56 cartridge, it's going to be able to hold that above 2,000 feet per second threshold to be able to get that optimal yaw type characteristic to greater distances. Whereas if you want to get a functional rifle to the same length as this, you're kind of looking at like a Mark 18 with a 10.3 inch barrel. That's pretty short. That's going to lose a lot of velocity very quickly. It's not necessarily going to be able to reach out to the same range and have the same ballistic effect. Sure, you could shoot this and a Mark 18 out to 300, but this is going to have more ballistic capability if you're using the same bullet in it as opposed to the Mark 18, to where that bullet's going to more likely ice pick through the target. It's not necessarily going to scramble up the ensigns like we expect the 5.56 to be able to do. That's something to keep into account. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about mag changes real quick, all right? Now, I have trained my entire adult life around the AR-15. So my mag change thought process is pretty much built around the AR-15, and I've been diversifying it by working with this weapon system quite a bit. Now, how I've been trained for years is to conduct my reloads from workspace, to rotate the weapon up. This way I can see what it is that's going on with my reload, or perhaps checking for a malfunction, as well as being able to scan the area for threats and all that type of stuff. And that's important also if you have MVGs on, to be able to kind of bring it into something that you can see what's going on. Also get you nice close into your workspace, because your spatial awareness, the closer you get to your body, goes way up as opposed to when you're trying to do stuff way out here. However, you also run into a couple of things with training and all that kind of stuff. So right now, if I was in a dynamic situation and I had a handgun on me and my rifle stopped working, ran dry, malfunction, whatever it may be, I would transition to a handgun at that point. Get myself to cover, and then rotate the weapon system up into workspace and conduct a reload. Now, what's being trained more and more here recently is to reload off the shoulder, which is interesting to me because it does keep you threat oriented. However, you kind of run into a little bit of like tactics versus techniques at that point, right? So if I'm in a scenario where I'm shooting my rifle and fighting somebody, am I really going to stand there and conduct a mag change to be able to remain threat oriented when I potentially have a handgun or something like that that I can go to and fight my way to cover to be able to then conduct my administrative actions on the rifle? Now, if I just had a rifle, reloading off the shoulder makes a lot of sense at that point, but also so does finding cover. So not really here to necessarily debate tactics as much as discuss the pros and cons between trying to do this type of reload. Now, on this rifle and a sling, having the sling deployed would help as well, but especially if you lengthen the stock, you do have a lot of weight balance out towards the front. So conducting those reloads off the shoulder might become a little bit of strain on the arm. And if you're doing this stuff through like a course or something like that, you're doing it all day, that strain could really build up and play into your fatigue. Something I've noticed about bullpups is that you have this real rear bias on your weight, which is fantastic, first off, because if you needed to shoot with one hand from the shoulder, you could. It would be relatively controllable. However, in addition to that, when it comes to doing mag changes, it pretty much only makes sense to do them off the shoulder in a bullpup, in my opinion. You could rotate up in a workspace. However, I'm not seeing anything in my peripheral vision as I'm scanning for threats or whatever it is that I'm doing at this point, because my magazine well and my chamber are down here. I have to bring the rifle up like this. This is putting undue strain on my arm at this point. Why would I do that? Whereas if I keep it into the rifle, my spatial awareness is high because I'm working in nice and close to the body, and I can do all the things that I need to do right back here. Now, in addition to that, most bullpups have their magazine release back here with the magazine well. The X95 is actually outstanding in that it has its magazine release in the same location as, say, like an AR-15. So for those types of rifles, it makes even more sense to go ahead and keep it on your shoulder. You can strip that magazine out, secure your new magazine, lock in your magazine, and then get right back to work. And especially it being so tight to your body, you've really got a lot of control over what it is that you're doing. It's fairly smooth. In fact, why don't I just go ahead and roll in some footage of a comparison between these two rifles. Now, before I do that, I want to let you guys know right off the bat, I don't have my timer out there on this one. I brought it out, but the battery was dead. So in this case, you're just gonna kind of have to watch what's going on and draw your own conclusions on which one's more fluid and fast. All right, so that's magazine changes in a nutshell. And a lot of that's going to come down to which rifle it is that you're working with. Now, let's go ahead and talk about triggers. Triggers are a frequent source of complaint whenever it comes to bullpups, and that is because you have a linkage that goes from here back to here in order to discharge the round. And I kind of make it akin to if I was trying to flip a light switch with a broomstick. Huh, that was relatively easy. It's not that I can't do it, it's that it might feel kind of weird in the process of trying to actually perform that action as opposed to just walking over with my finger and flipping the light switch. On an AR-15, I have a wide variety of drop-in triggers that I can get in there and get the trigger weight and, feel and all that type of stuff that I want out of the trigger. Geisley, all kinds of different people that I can go to and get really great trigger pulls from. I do not have that same type of opportunity with bullpups. There's a little bit that you can do to clean them up and all that kind of stuff, but they're always gonna feel a little weird, a little stagey, a little creepy and all that kind of stuff. To me, it's not a big deal. I don't have any issues with the trigger on this particular rifle. For some people, it's the end of the world, and that kind of just comes down to individual pure preference at that point. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the location of our ejection port. Now, on a lot of bullpup rifles out on the market, you have ejection ports that go out to the side. We'll talk about the other types here in just a little bit. And that becomes an issue if you are a left-handed shooter, in the case of the L85, or if you're doing any type of cross-shoulder transitions. You might potentially wind up taking brass to the face. Now, the X95 and a couple other rifles out on the market can be switched over to being left-hand ejection. However, that's not a field expedient prospect. It's not something that you're just going to rapidly change. It has to be set up beforehand, and if anything happens to your strong side arm, you're still going to have to make that transition and potentially eat brass as you shoot the rifle. Something to keep in mind. When I first got this rifle, took it out to the range with the wife, she shot it, she's left-handed, she had a little bit more open blouse that day, she has a burn, and it's my fault, apparently. So, something to keep in mind for the future. Now, I myself, for the most part, have not been affected by ejecting brass out of this particular rifle up until here recently when I was working off a barrier, and I actually took a couple of brass casings to the chin, about 4 of them. Actually left little burn marks on my chin. And I think a lot of it had to do with just, I was working off a barrier, and I was in a little bit of an awkward position, body position for what I would normally be on my support side shoulder, and I wound up taking a couple of them. It's the first time that it's happened. But it's happened, and it's definitely something to keep in mind as you're working around the rifle in different dynamic situations. Now, some rifles do take a different approach to that, and a lot of them utilize a shoot type system. The F2000 and the Keltec RFB, or Rifle Forward Ejecting Bullpup, are examples of having a very long shoot that actually ejects brass out near the muzzle. Now, what is that rifle? I just had it a little bit ago. MDR, Desert Tech MDR. Ha, got it. Buffering. Anyway, the Desert Tech MDR actually utilizes a similar system, but it's directly over top of the side ejection port. You can remove it and have cartridges eject out the side, or you can install a little chute that shoots them forward from right where they're at. That's an interesting process. One of the issues, first off, that MDR has had a lot of teething issues in its development and hasn't been doing all that well. But also, the big issue comes down to, on the other designs, specifically the F2000 and the RFB, is inspecting your chamber in case of either clearing or if you have a malfunction, in which the F2000 has like a little lid that you got to open up and then be able to look down into it and all that kind of stuff. That's something that you run into with those. It's kind of a manipulation thing. Now, Kel-Tec also produced the RDB, which is rifle downward bullpup, downward ejecting bullpup. And that actually has the ejection port to the rear in the buttstock, and it goes straight down. Now that becomes a whole new manipulation whenever you're trying to clear the chamber and all that kind of stuff. But I do not care for that setup. Now, it's not just taking brass to the face that becomes the concern whenever it is that you're working around a barrier. You also run into an issue whenever you're doing rollover type positions to where you could potentially take brass into other parts of your body, potentially have it launch down your shirt or bounce off of your torso into other locations. And I can actually demonstrate this off of a barrier, and I'll roll that footage here now, comparing this and the LWRC. Go.
Engage.
All right, so as you guys can see here, if you actually, eagle-eyed viewers will have caught it right in the last frame with this rifle. When I switched up to the second position, which was an attempt in order to be able to better work around the rifle, you'll note that as I came up, there was brass in the chamber. That cartridge had bounced off my chest back into the chamber. Now, could that have induced a malfunction? I don't know. It was the last round. In theory, the chamber, if there had been more rounds, the chamber should have been closed up before that round could have made it in there. Maybe. Or it possibly could have induced a malfunction. Who knows? It's just a data point that's important to think about. Perhaps if I'd had to do a reload at that point and I hadn't caught that, I could have potentially put myself into a weird double feed type position as I tried to reload from that position and get that magazine and round into the chamber. just something to consider, guys, with all this stuff. I'm not necessarily saying one way or the other as much as I want to give you guys data to kind of chew on and come up with your own ideas. Now, let's go ahead and talk about shoulder transitions with this rifle. Now, with an AR-15, it's pretty standard to, whenever you're conducting shoulder transitions, first you swim out of the sling, then you grab the front of your trigger guard, transition over to the other shoulder, and then rebuild your grip. That is how that is taught to be done. And that's pretty simple, right? With bullpups, it gets a little different. So, grabbing up here on this, which would be kind of equivalent to where the magazine well would be on a standard rifle, is not very helpful because of the weight balance of the rifle. So you do have to come back closer to center. Now, what I've been doing is grabbing the front of the trigger guard here, punching out, bringing it over, and then rebuilding my grip. And that has been going pretty all right. However, there's something that I've noticed. First off, grabbing the front of the trigger guard puts me awfully close to the trigger. Now, this kind of comes into a debate as to when to turn on the safety. And I've known multiple instructors and world-class shooters and all that kind of stuff who own up to the fact that they don't necessarily put the weapon back on safe every time they're conducting some sort of manipulation. It's something to consider. It's definitely not as linear as some people might make it out to be. So if I'm in, let's say I'm somewhere and I'm practicing just doing shoulder transitions, I'm threat oriented the entire time. I'm not working around any types of barriers or anything like that. I'm facing downrange and I'm just going back and forth between shoulders. It's not that unusual that I won't put the weapon back on safe. That I'll just pop it over, pop it over, pop it over, pop it over. Been there, done that. Now, you might not want to practice that type of thing if you're working with a bullpup and you're concerned about potentially coming in contact with the trigger when the weapon's not unsafe. Now, if you're working around barriers and stuff like that, or you're pieing corners and all that type of thing, you might want to put the weapon on safe, just because you don't necessarily want to ende into like a concrete wall or something like that and get hit with a whole bunch of bullets fall and put yourself out of the fight that way, or give away your position, or any other number of bad things that might happen if you're sitting there conducting, any type of manipulations with a firearm when it's not oriented at an opponent and it's not unsafe. Any of those types of things. You got a bad guy in your sights, do what it is that you need to do. Don't have a bad guy in your sights, maybe rethink what it is that you're doing. Now, on this rifle specifically, having my magazine release located right there, it's also given me a little bit of concern that at some point I might accidentally press the magazine release. However, it's not happened yet. Now, something else you could do would be to come back and grab here and transition over, which, in all actuality, doesn't feel that bad. My only issue with it is that it's very different in the manual of arms from the AR-15, and I kind of try to keep things as close to each other, and like the functions that I'm conducting as I work between two different weapon systems, I try to keep them as similar as I can so that I don't necessarily run into some sort of weird bad habit between the two rifles. So at least for the moment, I'm going to keep my transitions going off the trigger guard and probably flipping the rifle on safe every time I do it. Rolling some footage. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about working this thing around a barrier, because one of the things that I find to be the greatest test whenever we're talking about something that's supposed to have all these great advantages for being compact is how well does it work around a barrier. Because that's supposed to be the whole idea, right? Tight, confined spaces, maybe some unnatural positions. If the rifle doesn't work well in those positions, is it really a good choice if that's the type of fighting that you might have to do? If you're just sitting there shooting static on a range, it's not a big deal. But the moment you actually have to manipulate it around barriers, it might be a big deal. So let's go ahead and roll in some footage and let's discuss some things. And go.
go.
All right, now that is the same footage that we saw before. However, there's a couple things that I want to point out. Because of how this optic has to be set up, and it has, on bullpups, it generally has to sit fairly high. It's got something to do with the short, compact overall system, and then, you know, face height and all that kind of stuff. This made those really low, very compact positions very difficult to get on top of the optic with. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that I was losing my dot. I don't know what was going on that day, if it was just the angle of light or what, but I have shot in brighter conditions and had less issue with being able to find my dot. So, I don't know what's up. I don't know if like the batteries in this starting to die or something like that, but this optic's getting replaced because that was unsatisfactory. At some point, it's not necessarily like it's happening tomorrow, but that's something I'm looking forward to upgrading about this rifle is this optic. And I've had some reservations about the optic in the past, but now they've kind of come to a head with this not necessarily doing what I wanted to do on this particular day. However, as I got into those really low positions, I was really having trouble getting onto the optic, in addition to, you know, working around the ejection port and all that kind of stuff. Now, note that I was trying to keep everything as compact as I could around that obstacle. I didn't necessarily give myself any free lunch with being able to hang my legs out the side and all that kind of stuff that maybe would have made it easier to be able to get on the optic, purely because I was thinking of it from the standpoint of not wanting to get shot at all and trying to be as constricted by my cover as I could be. So that's what made this really difficult, whereas with the LWRC, I really had no issues. Yeah, I mean, getting down on the gravel was not particularly fun, and I greatly regretted the decision to not have elbow pads that day, but I had no real issue with getting into any of those positions and shooting in the ways that I needed to do so. I hit all the targets that I needed to hit, like everything went exactly how I wanted it to go. And that is why I like keeping, to me, nothing actually effectively replaces the AR-15 because it works so naturally with me. It's so ergonomic, the manual of arms is so simple and well thought out. And even getting into those very unnatural positions, I had less issue than I did with this rifle. Now, does that mean that I'm throwing this rifle out of my defensive rotation? Not even slightly. I still really enjoy working this rifle. And if you want to talk about pieing corners, that is where this thing really does well. I have a lot of very tight corners in my home. This rifle is much easier to pie those corners with, especially being so nice, compact, tucked into the body, than any of my 16-inch guns are. In fact, the only AR-15 I have that effectively competes with this X95 is my 6.5-inch 300 Blackout SBR. That's the only thing that even comes close. And it's just a tad shorter than this rifle is. And has the manual of arms that I want. So in that case, it does a really good job of competing with this rifle, but this rifle has a lot of character. It has a lot of capability that I'm not willing to overlook. As much as I'm just now aware that there's just some intricacies in working with it. And that's the thing that I want to get across to you guys. Now, in my own opinion, what conclusions do I draw from this comparison? Well, first off, if you're wanting to stick with an ultra compact 16-inch gun for your day-to-day things, you want to be able to reach out to 400, you also want to be able to get in nice and tight and pie corners and all that kind of stuff, this is a great option. 16 inches, no NFA paperwork, nothing crazy going on with it, but it's just as compact as a lot of AR pistols or SBRs out there on the market. This thing is a great choice for that matter. In addition to that, some of the other offerings, a lot of them with the rear placement on the magazine release would be a great option for anybody who's coming off of an AK and want to get into something that perhaps has like Stanag magazines and all that type of stuff. Now, key thing to keep in mind with Stanag magazines and bolt hold opens. Not all bullpups are built equal when it comes to bolt hold opens, or specifically bolt releases. So in the case of the Steyr AUG, with waffle mags, you have a bolt release. However, if you go over to Stanag, you have last shot hold open, but no bolt release. So you will have to come and run the charging handle. If you're coming off of an AK, that's not a big deal. Already you're in a better position. Sorry, I had to adjust something. Already you're in a better position because, well, you've got Stanag magazines and 5.56 and all that kind of stuff. You've got a lot of options that you didn't have previously with your AK, as well as having a manual of arms that's very similar, that's going to come very naturally to you and allow you to better integrate with that system. All right, guys, I think that's pretty much what I have on this comparison. So I hope you guys found this thought-provoking and interesting, and have a good day. All right, for anyone who stuck around real quick, I want to go ahead and address kind of something that I'm seeing coming up here in the future. So over the next year, I might have a couple of gaps in coverage to where I'm trying to build a backlog of videos to make sure that I can keep some stuff like ready to go and post and all that kind of stuff, but I might run into some issues with internet accessibility and all that kind of stuff. I got to go do some work stuff, and it's going to cause me to be out of my normal area for a little while. It might cause some gaps in coverage. So what I'm thinking about doing is starting a YouTube channel for the channel, or YouTube channel, a Facebook page for the channel. That's what I meant to say, my B. Anyway, and what I'm interested to hear from you guys is, first off, if there's any interest in joining a Facebook page for the channel, but also what would you want to get out of that Facebook page? And what I'm kind of thinking right now is like doing some like discussion boards, maybe a little bit of behind the scenes content, bonus content type stuff, stuff that's just for the subscribers and everything, or just for anybody who joins the Facebook page, as well as being able to just maintain interaction with you guys. So I'm not put in a position to where like I was supposed to just step out down to the corner for smokes and never came back. That's not what it is that I'm trying to set up here with you guys. I want to be able to remain interacting with you guys as much as I can, as much as the situation changes as I can, so that it's not a year from now I'm back up to posting videos every week, but the subscriber base has completely become non-existent. So that's something that I'm looking forward to the future, and I would be interested to get you guys' feedback on that in the comments section. Let me know what's up. All right, now that's all I got. Have a good day.